This is Success in Excess, where elite founders, lawyers, and clinic owners engineer success through strategy, scale, and systems. Powered by GrowthX.
Welcome back, everybody, to Success in Excess. I'm your host, 𝐓𝐚𝐫𝐮𝐺, founder of GrowthX Innovatech Solutions. Today's guest is one of the top personal injury attorneys in the United States and probably one of the best-known names in the Carolinas. Part of 𝐓𝐵LLIN, 𝐊𝐵LLI, and 𝐸𝐼𝑛𝑎𝑠𝑡𝑎𝑝𝑢𝑙𝑜, Roy 𝐊𝐵LLI is not only one of the top personal injury attorneys, he brings a new depth to the field of law with his empathy, the way that he handles his trials, and balances life as a law firm, attorney, lawyer, father. So today, I want to introduce everybody to Roy 𝐊𝐵LLI. Roy, you've had so many tremendous successes in the past couple of years, accolades, achievements. The firm has grown. You've been on TV, local news channels, and have handled some major cases. One of the biggest cases, I believe, is you had a $700 million verdict, which at that point in time, and I think even currently, is South Carolina's largest, reported on record. So tell us how you got started and what took you from, becoming as an attorney to now holding one of the largest settlement cases in the history of the Carolinas.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And first of all, thanks for having me on today. And, I really got started. My why is I refuse to allow people to be taken advantage of. I was, the skinny, freckle-faced kid on the playground. And, I really used that experience and what I, viewed at that time as certain injustices has really guided me throughout my process. I was raised in the beginning part of my life by a single mother. I've seen people get taken advantage of, by the system, so to speak. And it's something that I decided, when I was deciding, what am I going to do? How am I going to spend my life? I wanted to help people and to help people not be taken advantage of because they didn't know the system or because they didn't have power or money to impact the system. And so that's why I became a trial lawyer. In this profession, we every day get to wake up and stand for people against multinational billion-dollar corporations and bad actors. And we get to do that. We get to take these cases in front of juries of their peers. We have a very special thing in the United States with our 7th Amendment, the right to a jury trial in a civil case, where just regular people get to decide what's right, what's fair, what's just. And it's really special. And it's one of the great joys of my life that's how I get to spend my time.
That's great that you brought that up. The 7th Amendment, the right to a jury trial of your peers. Now, when handling personal injury cases, where would you have your take when it comes to, settlements versus verdicts? Which route would you prefer to go? I know there's a lot of ethical questions nowadays with, PI attorneys just trying to get their clients to settle. So, less billable hours. But, the way that you've carried yourself, your practice, the way you've grown the firm, and really how you portray yourself and what you've been known for is having that extra matter of care, going above and beyond for your clients and making sure that you're not settling for less and you're actually getting the justice they deserve. So kind of what's your take on settlement versus verdict?
Yeah. So what I'll tell you is what, I always tell my clients. First of all, it's the client's decision. And there are lawyers that, we've heard about. You just mentioned that we'll try to push a client, into accepting a settlement. And I'm not one of those lawyers. And I tell my clients, I say, my job is to give you all of the advice and the experience that I have so that you can make the best decision for you. Because at the end of the day, this is one case among thousands that I've handled. This is probably your only case in your whole life. And you have to be able to wake up every single morning, look at yourself in the mirror and know that whether you chose to settle or whether you chose to go to a jury trial, that you did the best thing for yourself and your family. Now, my personal experience is that on average, on some, people always get more at a jury trial, right? Because a settlement is where both sides walk away unhappy. And the insurance company or the wrongdoer has agreed to pay some amount of money and the plaintiff has agreed to accept that amount of money. they didn't want to pay anything, so they're unhappy, right? They'd rather pay zero. And the plaintiff is generally unhappy because they feel like they didn't get the full measure of their damages. And so I have found that, on average, people get better results if they have a righteous case in front of a jury. And I went to law school to try cases. I didn't go to law school to settle cases. I didn't go to law school to sit in mediations and just accept whatever the insurance companies were willing to pay. I went to law school to be a trial lawyer. That's what I like to do. So in a personal sense, that's always my preference. When a client says, let's load up and go to trial, I'm all in, assuming that they've made that decision, based on the information that I provided, and it's a decision that they can live with. A lot of times, when we go to trial room, we have offers on the table that are significant amounts of money. I have a case now that we got a 7-figure offer, on the case. We've already collected significant money. But the client wants a trial, and they want a trial because for them, it's not even so much about the money and the possibility of getting more money. It's the other part of the settlement. So in a settlement, there's a document that has to be signed where basically the other side doesn't admit to any wrongdoing. It's a release. It's basically says you release all your claims and this is not an admission of wrongdoing, and everybody moves on. And this client really wants, the community to weigh in on the conduct in that particular case. And the client's entitled to that, and I'm glad to do it. I'm glad to go put up a trial. That's why I went to law school. In some cases, settlement can be best for a client, right? Because a jury trial, first of all, it takes a while to get a jury trial in our current backlog after COVID. And even once you get a verdict, if the verdict is too big, a lot of times they will appeal, and that's another year or two, down the road to get the appeal heard. And then depending on that, you might get paid, you might get your money at that point, or you might have to go back down for the lower court to sort out some issues. And so, it's a longer process. But for people that have a righteous case and want to go to trial, I'm more than happy to do that. That's what I am. I'm a trial lawyer.
With that, you brought up appeals, you brought up verdicts, even very large verdicts. And I know there's a current, conversation going about the PI field right now, especially with these very large verdicts that are coming about through jury trials. But what happens when, let's say, in just your opinion and your experience, let's say there's a cap on, the insurance liability for whatever damages. Now, you get a higher verdict, and let's say the verdict is, we'll use a round number, let's say 10 million. Now, we've seen that in many instances, these large verdicts look great on paper, they're great optics, but in reality, a lot of the times people don't ever really see that money or collect even a large percentage of the verdict, that is awarded to them. So what's your take on that aspect?
Yeah, so that's absolutely true, right? You can't get blood out of a turnip. If an insurance company in a lot of states had the opportunity to settle within the policy limits and did not do so, and then you take it to trial and get an excess judgment, in many states, the insurance company can actually be on the hook for that full verdict, for that full judgment under various theories. In South Carolina, they have, the Tiger River Doctrine. In Georgia, there's another, several states, there's different aspects where you can actually open up a policy and not be capped by those insurance liability limits. The other side is obviously when you're suing an individual or a company, their assets are collectible, right? If they didn't have insurance, then what you would have to do is actually collect their assets. If it's a trucking company, you might be able to collect their trucks or their buildings, that sort of thing. And then obviously these large, multinational companies, collectability is generally not a concern. But that is a factor that every client has to take into account, is what is actually collectible. How much money, even if I go and get a $80 billion verdict, how much could I actually get, out of this person or out of this company? That is part, of that analysis that we have to do with every single client.
Well, yeah, you have to gauge the value of the case. And like you said, you can't squeeze blood out of a turnip. So in, many instances, we see that even, you brought up appeals that, insurance companies, if there is a large verdict, they try to tie people up in court. Now, I'm not as familiar with the case law, but let's say hypothetically there is a verdict, right? It's a very large verdict. The insurance company chooses to appeal, right? Because obviously they're trying to tie it up in court, maybe see if they can get, a different verdict later on, or let's see if it just can get wiped out. well, at that point, would the client of yours be able to settle and say, hey, okay, we got a verdict for 10 million. The insurance company is filing appeals. They don't want to pay us. Is there a method to go around that and say, hey, instead of us being tied up for 3 years in appeals, can we take a settlement now?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's often the case, right? So oftentimes after there's a large verdict, there will be, there may be an appeal filed or not. There has to be good grounds for an appeal. So, they can't just file an appeal just because. A lot of times the good grounds in my cases are, well, we just thought the number was too big. It's an unjust, unconstitutional verdict. And generally those, don't prevail in most places. But after that appeal is filed, or even before, the case could settle at any point, right? And going and getting a large verdict obviously will show the other side the value of the case and may increase those settlement offers. So that's something to look at. The other thing that happens is a lot of times in these cases, if they don't go ahead and pay all the money into the court and that sort of thing, interest starts to accrue. So every single year in South Carolina, Supreme Court sets an interest rate for what, the judgment interest rate is going to be, might be 8%, 9%, whatever it is. That interest starts to accrue on that judgment. And so if the person becomes entitled to that judgment because they win the appeal, later down the line, they're also entitled to interest on that judgment a lot of times. So, it's not just that amount you're fighting over. It's basically, and the interest rate's usually pretty fair. So it's generally a pretty decent investment return, that they look at. But yeah, a case could settle, at any point. I've had cases that, I settled a case one time, literally right before opening arguments. I mean, we had to work this case up. We picked a jury. We were literally outside in the hallway, and we had said that we would settle this case for the policy limits. That particular case, there was a 7-figure policy limit, as I recall, and they didn't want to pay it. And they say, okay, well, we'll pay 900,000. Say, well, no, it's $1 million, or we're not settling. And in the hallway, I mean, we go 900, 950, 975, 990. Can we get any break at all? No. Okay, we'll pay. In that case, my client wanted to take it. He didn't want to go to jury trial to try to get more in the interest and all that. If we could get the $1 million, he said he would take it. And so we did, but I've had cases that have resolved during trial. And certainly cases that have resolved, after trial as well. So you can settle a case at any point. The question is, how can you maximize the value for the client to, get them the damages that they're entitled to? That's really what we're trying to do.
That's interesting. Now, I have, one point that, I actually want to get clarification from you on, and we're going to play a little bit devil's advocate, right?
Yeah.
Now, across multiple verticals of sentiment, in various states, counties, areas, personal injury law is seen kind of in different ways. There's sometimes they're called ambulance chasers. Sometimes, they bring justice to families. But recently, people are concerned with the bias. So do you think that insurance companies going into a trial, based on, a jury of the peers of the person that you're representing, do you think that there's a bias to kind of be in favor of your client? Because most people look at insurance companies as, I mean, I hate to say it like this, but kind of like vultures, right? They never want to pay you. They always want to get paid. They try to give you a nickel and dime. So sometimes people see, hey, it's a little bit biased that, a jury is going to generally come back in the favor, even if the argument on the insurance side is valid.
Yeah. So I actually don't think that, and focus groups over time sort of prove that out. So number one, in South Carolina, when we try a personal injury case, we're not allowed to mention the insurance company. We're not allowed to even mention that the person had insurance for purposes of proving liability. So the jury really never hears about insurance. If insurance does come out, the judge instructs the jury that they're not allowed to consider whether or not there's insurance in this particular case, how much that insurance might be, or anything else. So when we try a personal injury case, the defendant, the person at the other table that we are trying it against, is the person that caused the car wreck, or the company, that caused the injury in the case of a premises liability case or something like that. It's not the insurance company named, as a defendant. So that's protection number one. We actually have to go and convince the jury that these damages should be awarded against this person or against this company, not against the insurance company. The other piece of that is I actually would argue, based on some focus groups, that the insurance industry has done a very good job through chambers of commerce and other groups over the course of time about talking about tort reform, talking about how, so-called frivolous lawsuits raise the cost of insurance for everybody else. Well, everybody on the jury, if they're driving a car, they have to buy insurance. And so it's in their own interest for the cost of that insurance to be as low as possible, right? And so if they believe, because they've heard over and over and over, that lawsuits drive up insurance rates, which, by the way, is categorically false. You can look at the data over the course of time. The insurance rates do not come down when there are fewer lawsuits. The insurance rates do not come down when there is so-called tort reform, or tort deform, as I call it, taking away people's rights to seek compensation. All that happens is insurance companies' profits go up, okay? So all of those things are totally false, totally bogus. But if people have heard that and people believe it, self-preservation would say, oh, well, maybe we ought to give less on this claim because I don't want my insurance rates to go up. So, that's how I look at it. That's what I've seen the evidence actually show. But again, insurance companies have done a very good job at telling the alternate facts story, as I call it.
I mean, they're absolutely great at that. I mean, stand by your side, we got you covered, da 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 da. I mean, they ingrain it. And, even as, let's say, a large personal injury firm, when it comes to resources and overall exposure and the ability to program a mind, I mean, insurance companies are, bombarding people daily, commercials, emails, ads. I mean, you name it, where it's always in the, protection of this person. And when you say tort reform and how the prices go up. So I think, the way that you said it is actually very well done. Now, in that aspect, there's been some sandbox in Congresses and different Supreme Courts across different states where people are looking at the option of bringing private equity into personal injury firms for investments. Now, one of the biggest arguments from attorney side is, it's unethical. What is your take on this new transition? Because, with emerging technologies, AIs, private equity companies wanting to invest in these firms, how do you think that's going to play a factor in these coming years? And where do you see yourself as a personal injury firm, not only just a firm owner, managing partner, but where do you really see the transition going in that way?
Yeah. So not only is it coming, it's already here, right? There are several states now where non-lawyers can own law firms through alternative business structures in places like Arizona, Washington, D.C., et cetera. So we're already seeing private equity investment in law firms. But here's kind of the important thing to note is that private equity has been funding and driving insurance companies for a very long time. And so personal injury law firms have, in general, always been outmatched in terms of resources, right? You take something like Geico that is owned by, Berkshire Hathaway, and you look at their balance sheet. No personal injury law firm in America. In fact, I don't know how many of the top personal injury law firms you would have to put together to even, get 1% of what Berkshire Hathaway has in terms of resources that they can expend. And so, we've always been outmatched. That's kind of how I look at it. And I think that resources are not a bad thing. I don't think it's a question of, well, do you agree, that this should happen? It is happening. It is going to continue to happen. Lawyers, the legal industry is always resistant to change. So are doctors, so are dentists, so are accountants. It's already happened there. We are in a market consolidation phase of the personal injury space nationally. That's where the market is. There is nothing to be done about that. It is happening, is going to continue to happen. And so obviously anything that's done has to be done within the rules, has to be done ethically. Some states do not allow outside investment in law firms. I predict that those states will eventually change, their rules, because what it is going to do is it's going to make their lawyers and their legal industry less competitive, right? And so those lawyers obviously our voters and campaign donors. And as they see this, I think, lawyers that are resistant to it will either adjust their perspective or they will be outcompeted. I mean, the fact of the matter is money matters in these areas and in markets, and personal injury law is not immune. It is a business, it is a profession, but it is also a business. We do this to feed our families, pay our mortgages, and just like every other business. And so it will develop as economics demands it to develop. And so, that's what we're seeing. And I think we'll continue to see that.
With that, you've done a lot of, public, commentary. You've been on news channels, you've been mentioned in various media outlets. Now, being in the spotlight, how do you manage, serving these families, managing the media, protecting the jury pool, while still being able to promote the firm and promote what you guys stand by, your mission statement, handling thousands of cases and giving that personal touch to each one? It's a very well played juggling act, but how do you manage to balance all this while still being a very high performing, attorney at the same time?
Yeah. So, I believe that the civil justice system exists to protect the community. And so I believe that when there is a danger in the community, whether it be, a car accident, whether it be a corporate wrongdoer, whether it be an insurance company that is not treating its insureds the way that it should, the public has a right to know, what's going on. It's why court proceedings are public. Anybody can go down and watch, a trial in America. And I think that's important. I think the media plays a important role in certain instances in terms of, publicizing and notifying and educating the public about safety issues and about what is happening, with particular cases. But, you're right. It is a lot to juggle. It doesn't necessarily make sense for every case and in every instance to have a media angle or that sort of thing. We certainly don't do it, in cases where the media isn't interested. So it's time management is really what it comes down to, right? And prioritizing. What I do when I look at any given matter, any given case, is I say, what is this client's best path to get the most money for what they have gone through, right? We want to maximize their recovery to get the full measure of damages. And let's be clear, in most of these cases, we're never going to get the full amount of damages, right? You talk about, we got a $700 million verdict. Well, she lost her daughter, right? Her daughter was kidnapped, raped, and murdered and buried in a shallow grave in a swamp. Is $700 million a measure of justice? No, of course, it is never full justice. There is no number that she would take, to not have her daughter back, right? She would much rather have her daughter back. We can never get her back to where she was before that happened. And so all we can do is make up for that in some small way through money, in some small part, right? And so in that case, in a case like that, the question is, how do we maximize the amount we can get to make up for it as much as we can? And really, in that instance, her goal was to send a message to other people that might do this, to say, if you do this, this community will take every single thing that you have and your family has that is collectible, right? Because this is how we measure it. So it's really sitting down and determining, okay, in this case or in that case, how do we get there? And then coming up with a plan and then executing the plan. We don't do, everything in every case. We do what we think is going to be the most effective for that case and for that client every time.
One of the things that I'm personally passionate about, handling, multiple verticals, handling multiple KPIs for the business, clients, and that we handle, I'm a big advocate on processes, like, handling processes, building processes, streamlining systems. So at the end of the day, we can identify and, very well, just like in case matters, a certain case could be requiring, X amount of work involved. You may not need a medical expert. You may not need depositions. You may not need all of these things. They may be able to get settled and go the easy route, not because the case doesn't require a high level of attention. It's because the case requires that much attention. And in that same essence, you evaluate, hey, these are larger cases with larger circumstances, which are larger loopholes that we need to plug in to really make sure that the defense is strong. But you're right. A lot of times, our measurement, our unit of measurement that we currently use in the justice system to alleviate or potentially fill those gaps, those pain thresholds that losing a daughter, losing a loved one, losing your ability to work, maybe being permanently disabled. The only unit of measurement we currently have is obviously money. And, you see a lot of cases where, people don't settle. And like you brought up the earlier case that you were handling where they didn't want to settle because they didn't want it to just be swept under the rug. They wanted it to be on record that, this company or this person, committed this act and this is how devastating it was. And this is, sweeping it on the rug. And I think that's a big problem that we currently face in the justice system, because what's the difference between that and people frowning upon a murderer paying his way to get out of jail, or somebody that's doing some other, a grievous, action that causes devastation in families, and hey, you throw some money at it, depends on how much, and now it's not on the record, you have to sign an NDA and say that, they're not liable, and it's sad. And the question is that justice, and you have to kind of balance it in that position and say, hey, what's best for my client? Money's gonna help their life, it's gonna help them, move on. It's not gonna fill the hole in their heart, but pursuing it in court may just extend that pain and stop the healing process, or at least, extending it before the healing process can begin. Now, in that aspect, in high stakes litigations, right, which you handle very much so, you're a trial attorney, you handle big settlements, big verdicts. How do you frame the damages so the jurors truly feel the weight of the family's loss or whatever, I guess, injury or any loss that they're suffering at that time?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of storytelling, right? And of using concrete examples that people can understand. And so one of the things that I say to pretty much every jury when I try a case is damages really have three components. They fix what can be fixed, they help what can be helped, and they make up for what can be made up for. And that's really all that we can do here today. That's all that the jury has the ability to do. And it can fix things like medical bills, right? If a client got a $500,000 medical bill, the jury can allow money in its verdict for that $500,000 medical bill. That money fixes that medical bill, right? It all goes to someone else. It goes to the doctors that provided the treatment for that client, but it fixes that bill. It doesn't fix the fact that that client has a rod and pins and screws in their leg, right? We can't fix that. No amount of money that is awarded by the jury can give that client back the leg that God gave them, right? That is never going to happen. But what the jury can do is they can help with that. If a person has a rod and screws in their leg, we know that their mobility is going to be impaired. We know that as they get older, arthritis is very likely to set in earlier, that they are going to need that hardware replaced, that they are going to need advanced aids to help them do things around the house and perhaps to drive a car and that sort of thing. And so the jury can help those things. It can allow money in its verdict to help with mobility issues. It can allow money in its verdict, to help that person be able to bring in a home health aide later in life if it's medically indicated that that person might need some sort of help around the house. And so the money in the verdict can help those things, but it can't fix it. It's never going to be able to give that person back the leg that God gave them. And then the last is to make up for. There are things that can be fixed, or the things that can be helped. And there are the things that can't be fixed and can't be helped. When that person was in the hospital for 6 weeks as they determined whether or not their leg would have to be amputated, and as they were undergoing the revision surgeries to get the rods and the screws, that person missed out on life. Maybe they missed their child's high school graduation, or maybe they missed their daughter's wedding that was during that period of time, or perhaps their mother died while they were in the hospital. Yep. And they weren't able to say goodbye because they were on a different floor and it was COVID. We can't fix that, and we can't help that. All money can do is make up for that. And there's something called the loss of enjoyment of life, which is money that a jury can allow in its verdict. It is part of the damages compensable under our law, that if the jury finds that this person lost the enjoyment of life in some aspect or had mental anguish, they can allow money to make up for that, right? And so that's how I explain those things to a jury. And then during the trial, what I try to do is bring in people that see different aspects, of their life that can talk about those things. Because one thing that we really don't like in America as a general rule is we don't like whiners, right? We like people that are fighting to get back to where they were. We like the underdog story, of the person trying to overcome. And so I don't want to put the injured person up there, to talk for an hour and a half about all of their ailments and all. And candidly, they're usually not very good at it because they're trying to be strong. They're trying to put on that face for their kids that are in the, galley, or their spouse that is watching from the first row. And so it's not as effective. But when I call in, the person that they worked with for, 10 years before the accident and say, tell me about some things you noticed around the office, after this. What was she not able to do that, she could do before? And you get those real stories that people can start to relate to. It really, it really has an impact, and I think illustrates it in the best way possible. That is something that I have found that, really just connects with people, right? Just like if we were sitting down and you said, well, my friend was in an accident, and you started telling me all these things that you noticed, that's a very powerful testimony, right? It's a very powerful, of course I would say, well, I'm very sorry to hear that. And, if there's anything I can do to be helpful, I want to be helpful. Well, the jury can't. The jury is there to be helpful as representatives of the community. And so we try to do it in that conversational way that makes sense, that is best for the client's case.
So we've gone over a few, of your tactics when you're going to trial, how you, familiarize with the jury, how you understand how your clients are really, dealing with some of the most devastating times in their life, if not sometimes the worst time in their life. And you're right, they may, God forbid they have more than one, but they may have one of these major situations in this life. And it's not like they're going to be going to court time and time again, testifying on different cases. And a lot of times, that pain and suffering that comes with testifying and going through that, even though it's very honest and they're very, they're being as transparent as possible, you're right, it comes off kind of whiny. But when you hear it from somebody else's side and say, hey, this guy was just full of life. He always used to work. He was a leader and very energetic. And now, he's just, he's not the same person. His, the spark in him is gone. He gets tired and winded very easily. We can tell, when it rains, his leg is in pain. Things like that seem to resonate with people much better. And it's kind of the same format of, a company saying, hey, we're the best company. A referral saying, hey, this guy is great. This is what they've done for us. So I think, with that aspect, you got it unlocked. You are a trial attorney through and through. So as we segue to the next part of our conversation, we want to talk more about how you've built and scaled the firm. Poulin Wheeling Anastapoulos is now one of the top powerhouses in the Carolinas. What systems or hires do you think made the biggest difference when you guys were really scaling that firm?
Yeah. So you talked earlier, you mentioned KPIs and systems and processes and procedures, and I could not agree more. In fact, it's most of what I write about on my LinkedIn profile is various aspects of the processes and systems and procedures and sort of things that, we are doing and looking for, because when you have a growing organization, you're going to have growing pains, right? And one of our commitments, one of the things that I really care about and focus on is, I want to ensure that every client that comes to our law firm has top quality legal service, irrespective of the primary attorney that's handling their case, right? I want their case to be handled like, I would handle it, or like whatever I would perceive the top attorneys handling to be. And so we create processes and systems around that, as we bring in, new attorneys, even attorneys that have been practicing for a period of time, to show them, well, this is how we do it and this is why. And those processes and systems are constantly changing. They're constantly evolving. They're responding to external forces like insurance companies and new insurance defense lawyer tactics, and new legislation and new laws and new rules and new ways of doing things. They're constantly responding. But those systems are really, are really important. And one thing you mentioned earlier is, for example, not every case is meant for a medical expert, let's just say, or a liability expert. One of the things that, we look at in every single case is the number that the client will get. Not so much the top number, although it's an important factor, but how much will the client get? And so I don't want, if we go hire an expert for a client's case, after the attorney's fees portion gets paid, if there's a recovery, the client actually pays that expert's bill as part of their recovery, right? That's where that money comes from. So if it's not absolutely necessary to maximize their net, I don't want an expert in that case, because my job is to get the client as much as possible, not to get, the lawyers and the experts as much as possible. So that's something, we do expert analysis on every case and we talk about it. You mentioned KPIs, we run on EOS. I know a lot of companies use the entrepreneurial operating system in order to run meetings and to run the cadence and, to run quarterlies. We do that. It's been a really good way, for us to basically have essentially 4 years every single year, right? Our quarterlies are essentially our years. And so we've been able to ignite that change. And key hires, we have teamed up with people that know EOS, know trial work, and know how to connect with people, because at the end of the day, that's what this is. This is a professional service organization. And, I say it all the time to people, 98% of the people that call 800 all sevens, they don't call for an attorney. They call for an audience, because they've never been in this situation. Mm-hmm. They don't even really know if they need an attorney or want an attorney. They want some guidance. Where do I go next? What happens? What does this look like? And so that's our goal, is to connect with people, provide top level legal services, and maximize their recovery. We don't do justice in its truest sense here. That's not what this is. I often say, if you want justice, you have to go to seminary, not law school. Justice comes, in an afterlife. We do civil justice, they call it, but really what that means is more money or less money. That's all we can do. We don't put people in jail in the civil justice system. If you kill someone's child, we don't go and kill your child. We don't do eye for an eye justice. That's barbaric. We do more money or less money. And we all know that that's not the full measure, of justice, but it's the best system we figured out. And so that's what our processes are designed around, is in every single case, processing thousands of cases, how do we deliver the same high level of legal service across the board? All the way from the very, very smallest, most minor injury case to the most catastrophic, injury case, loss of a child, loss of a spouse, that sort of thing. And we build processes. We say, if you find yourself doing something more than once, if it's your second time doing it and you haven't written down a process, stop and write down a process, because the only way that you won't have to do it yourself a third or a fourth time is if you have a written process that allows someone else to help. A lot of times we get in this as we're growing an organization. I'm sure you've been through it, where you say, well, it's just faster if I just do it. I know how to do it. I could do it, I could do it in 5 minutes. I can do it in 20 minutes. But those 5 minutes and those 20 minutes add up. And if 5 times ago we had just taken the 10 minutes, recorded the Loom video, or written down the process of how we do it, the next time it came up, we'd be able to hand it off and say, you can do it. Here's the process. Here's the video.
Yeah.
Here's what I expect the outcome to be. Go do it. I trust you. Because at the end of the day, what our team wants to be is empowered and trusted and feel like a valued team member. And I always say, we are a team. We're not a family, right? Because we're always trying to level up. A lot of companies talk about, or firms or organizations talk about themselves as families. We're not a family, because, in families, crazy Aunt Betty doesn't follow our process.
You
if,
still got her back.
we still have to have her, at the family reunion, right? She's still going to be there. She's part of the family forever. Well, on a team, if Crazy Betty doesn't follow the process, well, Crazy Betty's not going to be on the team very long, right? Because the team is trying to win. And if we have determined as a team that this system, this process gives us the best chance of winning for our clients, and you don't follow the system and you don't follow the process, then you're not going to be on the team very long. Whereas if we were a family, we just kind of got to chalk it up and say, well, there's crazy Aunt Betty again, bringing macaroni and cheese for the 85th time when no one eats the macaroni and cheese, right? So that's how we look at it, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, but those systems and processes are the key to ensure things are being done the way they should be.
Well, with that, the scalability model needs to have the elimination of bottlenecks. And just for instance, when you said, hey, yeah, I could probably do a lot of the tasks in the company, maybe more proficiently, faster, because I have more in-depth knowledge of the industries, right? I've been doing legal marketing for 15 years. I went to law school. My wife's a lawyer. My dad owns a law firm. I know this in and out versus, a marketing expert that's worked in the field for a little bit. But the difference is, and I heard this quote the other day, if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted, right? So if you put yourself in a position where the work you do cannot be replaced by somebody else, you don't have the ability to be promoted as a company. So let's say when you see a lot of companies go from founder, owner, CEO to now the founder, owner steps aside, they hire a CEO versus selling the company off. A lot of companies don't get the exit strategy because they're bottlenecked with the owner. And if the owner were to sell the company, market evaluation would say, hey, this is, a paramount individual in the company. If you were to sell the company and they were no longer part of it, the value greatly decreases because everything is dependent on them. Now, in that scalability model, what we've done, really with working with law firms is you see everybody looking to scale. And I love what you just said about, we're not a family because families, generally are not supposed to breed competition with each other, right? You don't want to compete with your mom. You don't want to compete with your dad. I mean, yes, there's some competition with siblings, but generally you guys are all built on a loyalty factor where a team, you're competing against the other team and you're competing within the team to get the highest spot, which breeds productivity. It breeds excellence. And most importantly, it filters out the bullshit because there's a lot of people that are underperforming. And another quote that I heard, when I was in law school, my professor, he had a very large law firm, ended up retiring, did very well in tax law. And he said, what's going to kill your business is the B players, right? The ones that have potential, that show sparks of good work, but they're the ones that pull you down. The C guys, they're the busy workers. You know what to expect from them. They give average work. You give them average work that needs to get done. You got the A players that they're going to produce excellent work. It's the B players that have sparks of, potential. They have the ability, but they always let you down, and you keep them around long enough because of that idea of potential, which ends up just putting you in a bad position. And I love that you guys are following these systems because, scalability is one aspect. People don't focus on sustainability, right? What happens? Can the firm handle an influx? And I ask people all the time, where is your business's health, right? If you were to have 50 extra cases this month, can your firm handle it? 100 extra cases this month. Where is your bottleneck in that point? And then understand if you want to scale, you have to build out systems that allow you, hey, we're bringing on 100 cases, we handle this much. When we start bringing on 120, 125 cases, we build another segment to encapsulate so we can handle 150. And that way you never have that point where you have a volatility spike. Hey, we're doing really good, but then the quality goes down. And then you start seeing, a downgrade because you've basically substituted quality for volume. And if your business is built on quality and not personal injury is not a volume system, right? Cases could have the potential of 30,000 all the way up to 30 million, depending on the quality of the defense. I mean, yes, there's some cases that, you're just not going to make it because it's a fender bender, right? But That's kind of how those systems work. Now, in that aspect, bringing up KPIs, one of the things that I've seen in what I personally believe, and has worked very well for us, is working with the mean, right? The mean of the case value. Because a lot of like marketing companies will say, well, our average ROI or our average, thing goes up to, 40x. But yeah, if your majority of your cases are, let's say, $30,000 to $50,000 settlements or verdicts, but then you get a $2.5 million pop, that doesn't really tell you what the average ROI is. So when you go and tell them, yeah, it looks good on paper, but what really are you guys producing? And in that aspect, how do you guys handle the influx of cases, the evaluation of the case, and most importantly, how do you deal with the tracking of the KPIs? Are you more focused on cost per lead or cost per acquisition?
Yeah. So answer the last question first. So we are focused on cost per case, cost per acquisition. Cost per lead is a vanity metric that marketers intended, that any phone call you get, whether it's valuable to you or not, is compensable. And I mean, you've been in this space, you've been in the marketing space, how gameable that is, right? Cost per lead is totally gameable. If I got you 5 leads today, and all of a sudden I want to decrease your cost per lead by 40%, well, I'll just call you twice from 2 different numbers. Doesn't do anything for your law firm, doesn't do anything for helping people, but it helps my vanity number. And we do the same thing on the legal side. I don't believe in vanity metrics. So when we're looking at KPIs, when we're looking at, one of the things we look at is how many multiples, you're able to get a client over and above their actual, their actual economic loss. So their lost wages, price of medical bills, et cetera, et cetera. In those cases, what we're going to do is we're going to wipe out the outliers. So your top 5%, your bottom 5%, we're going to take a mean and median of that middle 90%, right? Because to your point, everyone's always going to have big hits. It's a numbers game. Everybody's always going to have ones that, are probably outside of their control. The client wants to undersettle the case, or maybe the client, lies. And so the case becomes something that, we didn't think it was at the beginning. And so, the strategy is, well, you need to just take we're not going to represent you anymore. So, that's going to be on the lower end, because we can't represent someone who is not truthful. So those things we take out, and then we take it in the middle, and we look at those in terms of scaling. You talk about bottlenecks. Well, there is one fact about a bottleneck that everyone seems to forget. It's called a bottleneck because it's at the top of the bottle. The bottleneck is always at the top. The person leading the team, leading the company, leading the process, if there is a capacity issue, they are the bottleneck. They have not delegated and elevated well enough for that team to be able to handle the capacity, or the volume that it has coming in. So the bottleneck's always at the top. And as leaders, we have to recognize that. Another way to say it is the buck stops here, right?
Yeah.
If there is some volume, capacity, quality issue, then it has to be addressed at the top of that team. If it's in this legal team and it's a lawyer leading the legal team, obviously, what's the lawyer's problem? Even if it's, this paralegal or that paralegal with the task, that they're not doing well enough, the lawyer has to sort that out. They are the bottleneck. It's at the top of the bottle. And anytime you have growth, you have scalability, you hit ceilings, right? If this legal team I know can handle, 100 cases, and all of a sudden, next month I'm bringing in 200 of those kind of cases, well, we have to do one of two things. We either have to turn those cases down, right, and say, we can't help you, call this lawyer, or we have to expand capacity. We have to, make sure that we have the capacity to handle those cases in the way that we want them handled. What we're not going to do is we're not going to say, okay, lawyer, well, all of a sudden you get 300 cases now instead of 100, because two things happens. Number one, it lowers the quality of legal services that those people are getting, right? It's just a fact. You can't give 300 cases the same attention you can give 100. I don't care how good you are. And it burns out your team, right? There's a reason that, in baseball, we have relief pitchers and backup pitchers, and we have a certain number of pitchers that a pitcher can throw before they take a break. And, we have on the field and off the field, and we have a designated hitter to give this player a break in the lineup and this sort of thing, because we all have capacity. We all have burnout issues, no matter we're playing a game like baseball or dealing with something very serious, like people's legal challenges. And so we have to be cognizant of that, every business is an imperfect organization because it's made up of imperfect people. But there are things that we can do with our processes and systems to ensure that we're getting, equality of outcome to the extent that we can in an imperfect organization. So it really starts at the top, though, and understanding that there will be bottlenecks, there will be ceilings, as growth happens. And when you hit a ceiling, you have three options: you decline, you plateau, or you bust through it. But if you're going to bust through it, you have to do something different. You can't bust through it doing the exact same thing in the exact same way with the exact same people that you've always done. It's just not possible. And so recognizing that, as you do, is the first step. And, then recognizing what you're good at and what you're not good at. Right. So one of the things that we have in our company is we have a non-lawyer actually that, she runs all of our meetings. She's our integrator. She kind of watches over, our meetings and our process and make sure that everybody has input. She's not obviously practicing law or making legal decisions or anything like that. She's running the meetings with lawyers to make sure people are heard, to make sure, that ideas are being shared, to make sure, processes are being followed. And in that integrator role, it's a very important operational role, just like in what you were talking about. Somebody who says, well, I practiced law for 20 years and my dad was a lawyer. And so, therefore I know everything there is to know about the business of law and legal marketing. Well, you don't. I mean, the fact is, and that, I mean, you could have a 5-minute conversation with that person and just say, well, tell me about the Google Penguin algorithm update. These people, they look at you like you have 18 heads. They don't even know Google Penguin algorithm, but it's a real thing, right? It's a real thing. And if you're in the Google space, then about the algorithm updates, which are happening all the time. About the changes, that are occurring on those platforms. Obviously, if you're in the TV space, likewise. And they're very different things. What lawyers know is that we have certain rules we have to comply with in our legal advertising. But, if you're not studying the best marketing tactics and the best players day in and day out, how can you know what is best? Just like someone off the street can't come in and say, well, I think we ought to do this on this legal case. Well, what about this case and that case? Oh, I don't know those cases. Well, okay. Well, you don't get, you don't have a valuable opinion to render on that topic until you know the basics, until you know the playing field, and I'm a big proponent in get the best people for the role, the best people for your marketing role, the best people to run your meetings. Even if you got somebody just on the team, and they're running meetings, that's important, right? Because the quality of our meetings is the quality of our freedom. We're going to be in a lot of meetings. And if our meetings aren't productive and we don't come away from our meetings feeling energized and fulfilled, that is a huge drag on our team, right? It's like, why football teams have cheerleaders? Well, because they need to keep their energy up. You go out there in a football game. I mean, just go try it in an hour and a half. I challenge anybody that's listening to this. Just go fall down 100 times. Okay.
And get hit.
Just in the clothes you're in, fall down and get back up 100 times in an hour and a half. You will be exhausted. Well, football players are not only falling down 100 times in an hour and a half, they're getting hit and knocked down, having to get back up, wearing very heavy gear. So the cheerleaders are important to keep their energy up, right? They play a very important role. And we don't want the people that didn't make the football team on the cheerleading team. We want the best people for the cheerleading role, right? Which are the people that can bring the energy, the men and women that can bring the energy so that the energy stays up. Same thing in a business. Whatever the seat is, we want the best person for the role.
With that, I can give you a personal take. So I've been doing this for 15 years. I owned another company prior to this, had an exit. And until I really understood the value and when I first started, I was looking at the bottom line. I was looking at, can I get the person that can get the job done at the cheapest cost? And for certain, in the beginning, yes, it was cost effective, but I didn't realize how much of a handicap it was. And I can say in our first 5 years, we generated around 20 million in revenue for our clients. Now, after we implemented that, now this year alone, we've done around 15 million for our clients. And in the past 5 years alone, we've done about 105. We've done 120 million total. And it was after I understood that you're right, the bottleneck is at the top. And if I want to get the best productivity, I have to have the best people to produce and not make them wear every single hat because it's more cost effective. If I have somebody that's running SEO, make sure they're the best at SEO and not just all around on page SEO. Have somebody for off page, have somebody for content, have somebody for social media, specifically Meta, Instagram. And then what we've learned is we were able to grow much better because the results just, exponentially increased, because now instead of everybody becoming a jack of all trades trying to manage, multiple KPIs, multiple responsibilities, they do what they know best. They're focused on it. And I'm a big advocate of education. I don't care who it is. If you're working for my company and even myself, we follow a servant leader platform where basically I don't care what you do, I'm going to be able to do it with you. And whether, right now everybody's taking classes on agentic keywords because AI implementation in SEO is growing, just like GEO is growing. And with that, if you're not having the investment in your team, right? What reason do they have to, be better? And a lot of people, they say these things, well, I don't want to pay for their education, and then they up and leave. It's a risk that you have to take, but then also understand that, in the time that they're there, I've had people leave and grow from the company. I've had people grow in my company, and it's no hard feelings. If I helped you grow, you came here, you worked here, you put in good work, I want you to leave here better than when you came in. Right? And it's a constant growth factor because I can even give you an example. I hired a girl about 2 years ago. She had about 10 years of SEO experience. And I had another individual who, for all purposes, we could say is a fresher. They had about 18 months of experience. Now, and this has come time and time again where the girl did not continue her education. Right? She had 10 years of experience, but all her methodologies, the strategies were old. Right? They were from 10 years ago. Where the guy that had 18 months, he was hungry. He knew that he didn't have as much as a knowledge set, but he was daily working on that knowledge set. And within 2-3 months, his results were better. And we ended up having to get rid of her, even though she had the most experience. A lot of times you see people, and that's in, various industries. If you look at IT, if you look at any tech platform, people can say, I've been programming for 20 years, but when did your education stop? That's the real question. Right. And it's just something that I've seen. I think the way that you guys have built your firm is amazing. I think what you have done in the past couple of years, is, to the personal injury space. You don't see it very often. I mean, I'm very safe to say that your firm is probably in the top 10 to 15% of all law firms in the United States, and definitely in the top 5 on the East Coast. And that's not because of luck. It's because of hard work, dedication, and being able to build a solid team around you. I can say, with this podcast, it was great having you on. We have a couple more questions before we end it out, kind of a little bit more relaxed, something, kind of off the hard topics of marketing, scaling, and case trials.
That's what I like to talk about. But
I mean, that's what I love too. But
I know you do. One little point on what you just said, because it just fits perfectly. I actually wrote on LinkedIn today about competence. And, there are high credentialed, low competence people in every industry at every level. But competence is not earned. You don't earn it by sitting in a seat for a certain period of time. You don't earn it by building a resume. You earn it by proving that you have it. And the proof is due every single day, because everything is changing, and we have to continue to prove, that we are competent and that, we are good at what we do. And we should. We shouldn't want to be a society that rests on our laurels and tenure and who's been sitting at the desk the longest. But to the people that are actually working hard and are hungry and driving forward. So that was a good point.
And just to kind of touch on that really quickly before we start to wrap it up, I mean, you couldn't have said it better. Competence is the key. And I always like to test people to see where they're at, right? It's me as a person, or even an individual. Let's say their salary for their tenure, their experience, and we'll just use a round number. Let's say $100,000, right? Well, let's say you offer them $50,000. Well, and you say, hey, if you can prove it, I'll give you $150,000 that you are the person, if you can produce, you're not capped at 100, you'll get 150. And a lot of times people use that experience and say, well, I deserve 100. But in my mentality, I have a hustler go-getter mentality. You tell me you're going to give me 50 with no cap, where I can go to 500, I can go to 1 million. Well, okay, I'll take 50 for a month or two, prove myself, and then I'll be at 1 million in a year or two. And that's really how confident but competent I believe I am in my work, because you're right, everything is changing every day. There's new legislature, there's new technologies, there's new methodologies. There's, like you said, Google has algorithm updates probably every other month. Follow that with Meta and new strategies being implemented into systems. If you're not, in any professional aspect, if you're not on a journey to accumulate wisdom, to go with your experience, you're always going to fall behind, time and time again. But as we close up, we have a lightning round, and it's 3 really quick questions. So the first one is, what is one trial habit you never skip?
One trial habit I never skip: I always pray before I walk into the courtroom.
What's one tech tool you believe your practice can't do without?
So we are built on Salesforce as our CRM, and we run everything through that. And I think without that, we would be in a very confused state. So I would say that one.
Salesforce, great tool, very great system, and just like everything else, they're always updating.
Yep.
What's one case lesson you wished you learned 10 years earlier?
One thing that I think I did early in my career is I had a very difficult time saying no to cases and being really clear about, my why and my internal driver. Because when you're a young professional, you really want to prove yourself, right? And taking the harder cases and getting the better result is, one way to do that, right? And there's more opportunities to do that. But what I've learned, is every minute that I spend on a less deserving case is taking a minute away from a case that could really impact someone's life in a monumental way. And so the ability to say no as a professional is one thing that I wish I had developed sooner.
I love that you said that, Roy, because it's one of the skills that I had to learn later on. And that came with getting with clients and whatnot, always saying yes. Every client was always right. It didn't matter, big or small. And I learned after having the ability to say no and say, hey, it doesn't matter how much money you have. If you're not ready to do this, it's not going to be successful. You could pay me $50,000 a month. If you're not in the position for growth, if you're not in the position to work together to make sure your business is able to grow, because there's only so much I can do from my position. And being able to, there have been clients that I fired. There have been people that, said, well, I'm going to pay you this much because I want you to do this. And said, no matter how much, it's a system of this. I got to line them up. You got to knock them down. I can't knock them down for you.
Right.
I can't, I can't go to case and represent your client. I can't go to the surgery operating room and do the surgery for you. These are things I can't do. So unless you're in the position, say, hey, I'm ready to grow. I'm ready to push forward. I'm ready to do what it takes to get to the next level. I'm not going to take your money because it'll just be a waste of money. And then it's going to look bad on my part because you're going to blame me at the end of the day, right?
I'm going to be stressed out because you're blaming me. I'm going to have a dissatisfied client. I'm going to have a bad Google review. We're going to have all of these things, all because I tried to help you when you weren't ready to be helped. And so that's not a good situation for anyone.
And nobody wants to hear about, they look at the Google review. They look at the bad relationship. Nobody cares about the in-depth context of, hey, they weren't ready to do this. They didn't follow through with their emails. Nobody cares about that. It was great having you, on the show today, Roy. One of the things that we want to take away from this is showing the audience more or less, what does it really take? Let's say if you can sum this up in one sentence. It might be a little bit tough, but I don't think so. I mean, you're a trial attorney. You know how to talk. In one sentence, if you were to talk to young attorneys looking to start their own firm in the PI space, what is one thing that you would want to impart wisdom on them going into this field?
Yeah, so it's real simple. Every day, every task, at the end of every day is just one phrase: trust in God and do the next thing.
Awesome. Now, if they are in the Carolinas and they are dealing with a personal injury matter, maybe they don't even know if they have a real case right now. Roy, how can they find you? How can they reach out to your firm? Where can they contact you?
Yep, they can call us 800-ALL-7s. It's just 800-777-7777. We answer our phones 24/7, 365 days a year. Consultations are always free.
Awesome. Great. Thank you for coming on the show today. Roy, thanks you for coming today. It's great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Own your growth. Scale with systems powered by GrowthX. Subscribe to Success in Excess for those who lead with precision and scale with purpose.